All right, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you. So I have a kind of an interesting talk today. This is probably different from many of the talks that I give usually, although snippets of this have been in other talks. What I want to talk about today is modern Orwellian states and how to prevent them. Who here is familiar with 1984? A lot of folks, yeah? Who here has read 1984? Perfect. So what if we wrote 2024 today and we thought about the technology that we have now and try to do what Orwell did around that time, and said, what if we deployed all of the technology that we have in this moment to try and build the world's worst Orwellian state? So that's what this talk's about. And we're going to go through these kinds of Orwellian states and what they might be able to do. We're going to go through how to prevent them. And then I'm going to talk primarily about secure communications, because that's what most of the people in this conference in this room are working on. And this is one of the key functions of being able to prevent this kind of problem. By the way, this is an AI-generated image. It was like a really nice, lucky shot, like very early. Like, only took 1 or 2 prompts to get to this, so GPT's thinking about it too. So a quick definition of what Orwellian states. Think of a draconian level of propaganda, surveillance, disinformation, denial of truth, and manipulation of the past, and so on. I think at the time, the level of surveillance that you could have was rate limited by just humans being able to monitor things like radio frequencies, and people didn't have the degree of recording or computational power that we have now. So in a sense, the original Orwell perspective was very tame in comparison to the surveillance you can have now. So today, like, what's changed since then? First of all, the most important thing is we have this enormous telecommunications network that has been this huge gift to all of humanity, enabling us to talk to everybody around the world and coordinate and cooperate in ways that are magical to our ancestors. At the same time, though, that same telecommunications network has cameras all the time, microphones, GPS tracking, all kinds of, you do most of your interactions through them. So most of humanity is now pouring all of its interactions through this same telecommunications network. And that's a great choke point for a would-be Orwellian state creator. Also, another major thread is the rise of AI. This means we can do massive scale data analysis. Nowadays, we have enough computing power to do it real time. We can do automated systems control, so you can have systems that are responding to situations real time. And you could even have behavioral ML models for all humans on the planet. So imagine that you have a digital counterpart that is predicting your every move, your every action, based on everything that you've said. And an Orwellian state creator would be able to use that to coordinate what the appropriate response would be to any human. And that's using existing systems today. Now, the last couple of years have seen this set of breakthroughs around the latest transformers. And so that means that now we have the ability to do massive amounts of content. And so that means that all the propaganda stuff gets dramatically easier. It means that all of the kind of disinformation gets easier. It means also that summarization of vast troves of data gets dramatically easier. So no longer are you rate limited by humans trying to parse lots of complex data. You can probably just feed most of it to transformers and figure it out. And this is only current AI systems. I'm not even considering what might arrive this year or next year, which we should expect will be significant breakthroughs, let alone something close to 2030. So let's talk through surveillance for a moment. As I mentioned, you could do this kind of complete surveillance of all humans on the planet. You could monitor all the traffic. You could look at all the metadata. You don't even have to decrypt the traffic. You can use inference on the metadata to figure out a lot of the interactions. You can tap into all of the phone data, GPS position, audio, video, communications data, health data. You can then, of course, crawl through all of the vast troves of social media artifacts and use that to feed into your models of people and what they might be thinking and what they might do. And also, we have CCTV everywhere now. We're like past the point of this being avoidable. We're like into the world of, okay, great, so this is the infrastructure that we have. How do we make sure that this remains human-aligned? In terms of propaganda, we have you could have vast level of control of news and publications. You could out-publish any other group of people. You could control facts and reality. You could flood social media. These days, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen the rise of disinformation and how difficult it is to get people to agree on what reality is. Plus, you feed in all of the latest stuff around just making these interactions real time. So not only are you publishing propaganda, you can now generate agents that are convincing people real time. So you could have an interaction with a group of what you think are people online, and they're not, they're just bots trying to convince you of something. You could also feed this into population control, so you could have straightforward control theory style behavioral feedback loops where you're measuring reactions and then adjusting certain parameters and feeding them back into the system and seeing how humans respond to that, and keep doing this so that you don't overstep your bounds as an Orwellian dictator or whatever, and make everyone so mad at you quickly enough that they overthrow you. You can instead do it very slowly to ratchet up the power and ratchet up the control and set in this extremely difficult. You can see the beginnings of these kinds of things in the credit systems that are being deployed around the world. Now, they're not extreme yet. There was a lot of concern about this a couple of years ago, and so far, credit systems haven't stepped very far into this. But the structure and the infrastructure for doing all of this is there now. So you could just change the parameters and alter how you measure and what you value to drive this. So think of the control theory style loops that pilot airplanes, and that applied to entire populations at a time. So you could do this today. This is the one where it's not quite there yet, but it's starting to get here. You could do automated enforcement of all actions. So in the digital side, this is already here. Real-time analysis and response. You can have a coordinated set of worldwide agents and operate at this massive scale. Although physically, you can't quite, this is the boundaries that we're passing now, where we now have large enough and good enough robotics to be able to have real-world automation, but it's not so good yet. For example, you can still escape robots by just going upstairs. Now, don't have to convince you that totalitarianism is really bad, I hope. And this is like a snapshot of like what that kind of Orwellian state can lead to. Because usually what tends to happen is some state gets into power, establishes this level of social control and surveillance, and then over time that power starts shifting and the policies of the state start dominating. And so it's never really the first group that establish that kind of control that end up using these kinds of policies. So how do these systems arise? So if you're already starting from a dictatorship, pretty easy, you just implement all of this Orwellian stuff. However, from democracies, it's not actually that far. You can implement most of these systems, and many democracies around the world have parts of this in the name of public safety. Usually, most of this kind of infrastructure and surveillance is extremely useful to do really good, legitimate public safekeeping and law enforcement, and all of that makes sense. However, the problem is that once you build it, you've built this apparatus that somebody can inherit. So that means eventually some bad-intentioned administration inherits those powers, takes over control, and then can start ratcheting up the control of what these systems give you. This is what makes it extremely difficult. And today, many groups are fighting about these systems. And usually, it's never really about the current administration. Most current administrations in democracies tend to be pretty good. It's a huge spectrum, of course, but we've had extremely bad governments in the past. So for the most part, it's not really about the people in control now. What everybody should be worried about is do not build these kinds of systems, because once they're in place, they can be inherited by groups dramatically worse than the ones that are in power today. Practically, for some kinds of states like this, you implement pieces of these systems, you demonstrate value for public safety, you start ratcheting up power and control, and then if it's successful, you start exporting it to other countries. So that's the dark picture of what Orwellian states you could build today if we wrote 2024. So how do we stop these things? So what's difficult for totalitarianism? First off, an educated public. So this means reliable media, schools and learning, and you need humans around the world to be drastically better able to discern what's right, what's true, what's not, and how to interact. You can also set up certain policies and government structures that make it very difficult for totalitarian regimes to take control. So this includes balanced government structures, very strong institutions, and so on. I'll talk a little bit about policy in a moment. Also, key technological improvements can help tremendously here. We'll talk primarily about secure communications, though coordination tooling can also be extremely useful. And last but not least, strong economies. It turns out, if you go back and look at most totalitarian rises, they tend to happen in periods of massive economic instability, because that's when people are at their most convincible of any kind of group that might alleviate situations. So by having a strong economy, you can prevent these kinds of problems. So let's talk about policy for a moment. The world has hundreds of democracies. There's lots of great, strong institutions. Most want to prevent Orwellian states. Most debate security versus privacy, and they tend to trade off security in terms of normal well-being and kind of law enforcement and so on, and privacy in terms of respecting people's right to privacy. But thanks to many bad examples like Cambridge Analytica and so on, it has been made clear that privacy is not really just about not divulging secrets. Privacy is a form of security. So in reality, the privacy branding is not great. We really should be thinking about privacy as a form of security. Privacy is security of groups and security of civilizations. So it should not be dismissed as an optional nice to have. This is fundamental. Privacy is fundamental to security. Now, there's really good political progress over the last few decades. The original crypto wars enabled encryption to be disseminated around the world. We have pretty good de facto worldwide communication. Many people around the world communicate freely, even though there are states, technically, where people started communicating over the internet in a more free way than they can communicate locally. And that was an amazing, really good result globally. And there are now strong proposals against AI-based social scoring and so on, like what we've discussed now. But all of that stuff is not in place yet. And of course, good policy can reverse in crises. So even if you build up a very strong, safe government, you can still get into a problem when any kind of major crisis like a war or a serious safety threat, terrorism and so on, can dramatically change the positioning of governments. So you can't just do policy, though it's necessary. So let's talk about technology for a moment. The way I think about it is this. If you want to coordinate actions between people, you need to be able to have discussions and plan together. And if you want to do that, then you certainly need to be able to communicate. You need to be able to talk. You need to be able to write and so on. So if we get, the bare minimum that we have to do is to establish secure communications globally. And then out of that, on top of that, we can create coordination tooling and then be able to coordinate actions of people. So let's talk about secure communications. I'll go through a number of examples of the things that we need to secure. All of these things are not good enough yet, and they have major holes and points of centralization where parties can take control and change how, basically put in place some kind of Orwellian control system. So first off, just the ability to move around packets on the network and being able to send and communicate between any two devices or any two programs on the internet, we should be able to do that in a secure, privacy-preserving way. Today, you can't really do that. You can go really far in certain kinds of networks, but you can still make all of the metadata about the traffic going into those networks be seen. And so in order for these things to really work, we need a huge fraction of the traffic globally to be going through those networks. And so they need to be good enough and work enough at scale and be fast enough that they become the default. It's just not good enough to have these not really secure structures yet. Now, the good news here is that we have had a ton of progress over the last decade and a half. Building on the successes of things like Tor and I2P and others, we now have new kinds of mixnets. We have very interesting new proposals for using zero-knowledge proofs and homomorphic encryption and so on to do routing of packets. Now, that might be way too slow, but we'll see over time if that becomes relevant. And then lastly, today, states can remove entire sections of the internet on and off, and you need to be able to circumvent that in some way. And so one way you could do that is do point-to-point radio links, although that's hard. Satellite might be an extremely good way, but you need to build a big enough constellation and have that constellation be self-sovereign or decentralized in some way, and today we don't have that. Talking about internet infrastructure, talking about DNS for a moment, most websites and most applications that you ever interact with have this like huge central point of failure, which is the DNS names. That is a huge area of control where all a party has to do is block certain domain. And because DNS is just such a useful, easy to use, successful system, it becomes a linchpin problem where you could have a super decentralized system and you have some critical part of the install path that requires some DNS resolution, and then suddenly the whole thing doesn't work. And so we really need to get to a point where we have proper decentralized naming. And good news here is that we have had a ton of progress. So we now have good blockchain decentralized naming systems, things like ENS, tuple domains, Handshake, and so on. But we need to be able to use these by default on browsers and operating systems. So today, all of these still ride on the normal DNS resolution pathways, and all of those are breakable. The CA system. So today, the CA system is pretty there's been a lot of improvements, but it's still very messy, and you can still fake a lot of certificates, and you can give certificates without full transparency and so on. So we really need to upgrade the structure to create a much more resilient system where you can see all of the certificates that are being issued, and you have a transparent way of certifying that something was generated correctly. And ideally, you should be able to have a certificate authority that lives on a blockchain that isn't actually run by any party and just automatically can sign certain names based on. So you can link this with this kind of system, and you can now get to like a properly secure point-to-point interaction using the current standards, but build it entirely on a blockchain system. Then after that, you need to be able to move around websites and web apps. This is the area where we've been mostly focused, being able to move around entire bundles of content, things like entire websites, entire mobile apps, and so on, move them around as a huge content bundle, and be able to content address it, make it independent of DNS, and so on. This is how the Cannell referendum signaled polling locations to folks using this, and that was like an example of testing this. Now, in that example, the DNS site got hijacked, both the original polling site and the IPFS gateway got blocked, but you could use standard IPFS protocols to then circumvent that and access it. However, a more sophisticated attacker could have just blocked all the routes, could have started doing packet inspection, and so on. So we're still like nowhere out of the woods. You also need to upgrade browsers. You need to be able to have all of these browsers and systems be able to use these protocols to hook into these new upgraded DNS certificate authorities and so on. And the app stores are this other choke point where, thankfully in Android you can have these other app stores that you can hook into and install your own applications, but you can't do that in iOS at all. And who knows if those would remain open in any kind of like major threat area. So again, in any kind of crisis, you end up in a position where all of this kind of stuff may be rolled back. So I encourage you to think about like just enabling basic communication applications. So think of one-to-one private conversations, one-to-many broadcasts, many-to-one, meaning reading lots of information, many-to-many, group chats and forums, and enabling all of these to be privacy preserving. That means reader and writer privacy and the ability to not detect that that activity is happening. So think of email, messenger, large group chats, forums, and so on. On top of that, you can start building more complex coordination applications like economies, payments, contracts, and so on, organizations like DAOs, DACs, and whatnot. And one other major problem is hardware. So today, we have a very small number of vendors. Phones are extremely hard to make, and our demands for that kind of product are so high that it's extremely difficult to see some kind of privacy-oriented system emerging. We might have some systems that might have some providers that could generate some devices that have some other kind of form factor that doesn't try to do everything a phone does. Or we could try to get all of these vendors to commit to strong requirements around global censorship resistance and resistance to manipulation and so on. However, all of these corporations can be coerced by various states. There's a ton of R&D that we need to do. And there's some really new, interesting tech frontiers that we will talk about today around zero-knowledge proofs, MPC, FHE, and so on, that could be used for these systems. Last but not least, an innovation cycle is key to all of this. So not only do you have to build a technology, you have to get the funding required to fund all of these operations. So having an innovation cycle where you can build applications, make them successful in markets, generate revenues, and take those revenues to fund more of this R&D and development is a key component of making this successful. So it's not, you can't just go and like work, because if you aren't successful in the market, you're not going to be able to hire enough people to build all this stuff. So overall, we've had a lot of progress, and so we're in a much better position today than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But we have a long way to go before we can be Orwellian proof, just given the current technologies. Good luck with all of this. Let's work on this together. I think that though this feels hard and scary, it's very achievable. We just have to be focused on achieving certain specific goals. Let's focus on securing communications. Let's get point interactions totally in a reader and writer privacy way. And then on top of that, we can bootstrap all of the other kinds of applications. Thanks very much, and have a great summit.
Inherited from a previous administration. All right, we are actually about ready to get into the meat of today with panels and more keynotes. But before that, I am going to do a very quick overview of the UPA, the Universal Privacy Alliance, so you can learn more about what we do, and if you represent a project and would like to join, please do approach us afterward. All right, on this slide, we have basically all the projects that are currently involved with the UPA. We're still very nascent, so a lot of things are changing. We're trying to recruit more members to join us. We're actually a little bit tight on time today, so I'm just going to read out some of these names. Starting with the L1s, we have Zcash, Manta Network, Alio, Mobilecoin, Anoma, Secret, and Oasis Network. Then one level up, we have Orchid, Aztec, and also Status. Status is not an L1, not an L2, but they make a lot of very important privacy-centric applications like the Nimbus ETH client. And then underneath all this, on the network privacy layer, we have NIM, currently the only project I know of working at this level. All right. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for reading my mind. Cool. So we have a website called privacyalliance.com, and to join the UPA, we all are privacy projects with slightly different goals, slightly different implementations. If you do want to join the UPA, you do need to align on 3 unifying principles. The first is that privacy is fundamental. It is a basic human right. The second is that privacy tools are normal. We're in an age where oftentimes when I talk about privacy with my friends, the first thing they say is, what do you have to hide? Why do you want to keep these things private? But what we at the Alliance want to do is to change the narrative into one where we say, privacy is normal, surveillance is not. And then finally, privacy by design, privacy by default. It should not be difficult for people to opt out of tracking. And ideally, people opt into tracking in exchange for something else, instead of having jump through many hoops in order to opt out of tracking. So these are our 3 unifying principles. Now, the overall goal of the UPA is to combine our resources, our financial and our intellectual resources, in order to fight, to be able to keep building privacy technology. For those of you who are familiar with the history of this, the US government some decades ago fought so hard and relentlessly to keep encryption out of the hands of the public. It was through very obstinate individuals, among them Diffie and Hellman, who some of you have worked with their work. They kept doing math. And today what we're doing together as the UPA is to fight for our right to keep on doing math and to build the tools for people to live freely. To that end, the main actions that we commit to undertake together are firstly to set up a legal fund in order to pool our resources. We're spending a lot of duplicated efforts at various venues of the world trying to fight to do our work. And also, we will work together to educate and advocate for privacy. For example, at our launch event in Bogota last year, we invited Edward Snowden to deliver a keynote, and we helped educate a whole room full of people about the importance of privacy and the things that was running through his mind as we observe the world around us today. And then finally, we will work together to make public statements. So when Tornado Cash happened last year, we didn't have such an alliance. So some groups put out statements, some groups did not. We didn't present a unified front. And presenting a unified front is how we win some of these very difficult debates. So if you do have any interest in joining the UPA, please reach out to any of us later on, or we do have a sign-up form as well on privacyalliance.com. All right. So that concludes my introduction to the UPA. We're going to move into our first panel. Can my panelists please come up? The first panel is called How to Build with Privacy First and Make Privacy Scalable. We'll have Chris, John, somebody from Aztec, Linda, Kenny, and Travis.
All right.
Okay, cool. So welcome, everybody. We have a panel of 5 different people representing 5 of some of the leading privacy projects. Very excited to start digging in. I'm going to let them introduce themselves before we kick off.
Cool. Hi, I'm Linda, head of ecosystem at Oasis. Very excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Chris Beck. I'm a principal engineer at Mobilecoin. I was primarily responsible for the design and implementation of Mobilecoin Fog, which is a privacy-preserving system for mobile devices to get their balances without cloud servers being able to figure out who was paid and who received which transactions.
Hi, I'm Kenny. I'm one of the co-founders of Manta Network, and I'm specifically focused on the operations side.
Hi, I'm Travis Cannell. I'm from Orchid, and I run product and marketing for them. And Orchid is a bandwidth marketplace that has a VPN running on top of it.
Hey, I'm Bruno. I run ecosystem partnerships for Aztec. We have a product live on Ethereum L1 today that lets you interact with L1 DeFi protocols completely privately. And we also are developing a zero-knowledge domain-specific language called Noir.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Let us start by trying to understand our title. What does it mean to build privacy first? If any of you have a comment, please volunteer yourself. And I think I'm going to start off with Chris.
I would say that building for privacy first means that you think about privacy from day one. You don't think of it as something where you do it later and where you do it later and kick the can down the road. When I think of, I don't want to give examples of people who kick the can down the road, but you can tell when a project has to change a whole lot of things because it turns out there are big privacy problems. Building in privacy from day one means that you're thinking about privacy and also how it impacts scalability, because private services are often very difficult to scale, or it can become a lot more complicated because if you know who is downloading what, or if you want to make a system where you can't know who is downloading what, let's say, then that's going to change a lot about how the system can work and how data can flow in the system. It just means that you're building for a future where everything is working, where the privacy is working, and you're scaling to lots of users and building something that's useful and going to change the world, that you have that kind of a vision from day one.
Yeah, I think something Chris said there that resonates with me is ultimately, at least for Aztec and some of the other projects up here, we're building open source infrastructure. The point is to give developers the tools to, is this thing still working? Yeah. The point is to give developers the tools to build whatever they want using, at least for Aztec, our open source infrastructure. And so it has to be privacy first. If you kick the privacy can down the road, then that infrastructure becomes difficult to build with, difficult to reason about, difficult to incorporate, and you end up actually missing the point of building this open source infrastructure for developers to just use easily. If they can't use it easily, if the DevX isn't good, if the UX for building with your open source infrastructure isn't good, it is really hard to get that adoption and to get people to treat privacy as the first class citizen. And so people just end up taking the shortcut and not actually using privacy preserving tools.
And also, if I sound a little shaky, it's not because I'm nervous, I'm just a little cold. But I think another aspect, I think this might have been something that John had brought up previously at maybe the first UPA event that I thought really resonated with me is, what are the implications of privacy first, especially in a world where privacy applications are secondary to the actual infrastructure, right? You get this sort of selection bias where you have these narratives that we have today, which is, hey, privacy is only used by bad actors, money launderers, et cetera, et cetera. The reason is because, or one of the reasons is because the entry barrier for using privacy tools is so complicated. Maybe it's a financial barrier, right? Because you're generating a zero knowledge proof directly through the browser and the gas fee is already like $100, $200, right? And so $100, $200 already cuts out a majority of users who just want to use privacy for a Uniswap transaction that is $20. So that is a selection bias. And then another one is the user experience, right? It's something where if it takes you 5 extra steps in order to enable privacy for whatever use case you're trying to go for, then you need 5 times as much of a need for that privacy than just, oh, you know what, I could just generate another wallet address and try to not link that to my identity. And I think people are going the let's generate another wallet address way rather than let's use privacy tools way. And so the people who end up using the privacy tools kind of self-select into that pool of people who are like, oh, I really need this for some heavy financial reason. And yeah, it just
That's a great point, the negative selection, the adverse selection.
To be fair, it wasn't my original idea. I think John had mentioned it before.
Right. I think the panelists really elaborate pretty well about what privacy is. Privacy first is, specifically, I think at Oasis, we're thinking about privacy kind of along those lines as well, but we also have our own thinking around, if we look at Web 2, we transition so smoothly from, if you open a website, like we transition so smoothly from HTTP to HTTPS that without most people even noticing it. And these days, if you open a website, that open URL that is HTTP, I think you will get automatic notification from Chrome or whatever browser you're using saying, hey, you really want to visit this website because it's not encrypted, it's not safe, we strongly recommend not. So we think that's what Web3 should look like in the future, that privacy is not just some sort of bonus or nice to have, some afterthought. It should become a default setting, at least being able to configure, construct confidential smart contracts should be in every single developer's or every blockchain crypto developer's toolkit that they should be able to use so they can construct smart contract, be fully public, be fully private, completely up to their users, whoever they're serving, up to their users' needs, versus just have what we have currently. Just because things are the way they are doesn't necessarily mean that's how things should be in the future, or that's already the most best or optimized way to do things. Yeah, so we hope that at some point in the future, we're definitely trying to move towards that, be at providing this privacy solution should be every developer's toolkit. Hopefully that could become some sort of default tools everyone uses, whether or not they are building a privacy dApp or something. But they should have the flexibility as to how they construct their smart contracts.
That's a great point. I think one of the challenges in privacy and integrating it into our everyday tools is there's a chicken and egg problem, right? You need to first get people to care. And to get them to care, they need to use tools that show them why it's a chicken and egg. It's difficult, which is why we're here to work on it. If we can double click, so I'm imagining I'm a dev in the audience, I'm a builder. As I start thinking about building in privacy features into my product, how do I think about what things I want to keep private? Like, what is it? Identity of my users? Is it the relationships between them? What exactly should I try to keep private? Is there a ranked order of priorities?
Yeah, I can take that. I think also just backing up, I'm a very product kind of marketing background, and so I was on Web 2, I was on the other side, I was a big ad buyer. I was actually using all this data that was being collected, and it is actually pretty hard to run a marketing operation and a website and all these things. Look at what happened to MailChimp. So you have to think about who do you want privacy from? Oftentimes people jump into, I want privacy, I want like perfect privacy from all governments, which is a very tall order. But if you look at what happened to MailChimp, now you have your email list is out there on the dark web, right? And now all your users or people that have been interested in your website are available to almost anyone for a pretty cheap price, and they can do different things with that. Is your web server logging IP addresses right now? Like right now, is your web server logging IP addresses? Like why? Maybe save, if you really need to see geolocation, maybe parse that IP address into a city or a state so you know where that is from, but an IP address is just way too much information to be storing somewhere, anywhere, even if it's with AWS. That information can be subpoenaed. And then are you using ticketing systems? Are you using all these things? Just grab user data and store it. And the challenge is then, it's just so easy to use those things. Everybody wants the intercom, everyone wants a Zendesk, everyone wants like a support ticketing system, everyone wants an email newsletter list, everyone wants a functioning web server. But those are some of the things that I think about in Orchid outside of the product realm, but just like how you're running your organization and what information then can be linked to your users, not necessarily people that are actually using your app, but just now there's lists out there of people that might have visited your website and different things like that.
But they're so useful. They help you sell your products better.
Yeah, coming from working from Intuit on the QuickBooks brand and doing really large media buys, I saw the move to mobile, because mobile, everyone knew how to clear their web cookies, but no one really knows how to change their advertising ID. I think people are getting better about that, but typically when I was in that industry, basically from the beginning of the phone to the end of the phone, everything was tied back to that device ID. It never changed. No one ever changed their ad ID. And then Google was using their crazy AI stuff. But when I left Intuit, half of my money was going into just universal app campaigns, which is essentially a black box that you're putting money into. The only thing that humans are still really good at is creative. So the bidding, the targeting, the segmentation, all that was handled by robots. And it was creative. It's like what images and what words you're going to use to describe it and how you're going to chunk that together. But
ChatGPT's been doing a lot of my creative lately.
I'm a Plus user.
All right, anybody else have hot takes?
Yeah, I could talk about that. When you're trying to think about what things should you make private, one way that I like to think about it is that there's no one person who owns the definition of privacy or what is privacy. Privacy is like a social norm, and when you're building a privacy technology, you're trying to offer a better social norm to the users. So when I think about what kinds of things should be private in a project, what I try to think about is like, how is this going to work from the user experience? So like, for example, with Signal, they communicate very clearly that when you send an end-to-end encrypted message, wherever you're typing in that text box that's going to go to your friend, no one else is going to be able to see that except your friend. And that's a message that users can understand. So it's not only important that your technology works and does what you say, it's really important that the users can understand it, that you can articulate it in a way that they can understand it and then use it correctly without thinking something will be private when it's not, because then that's how they can get burned.
Telegram.
Yeah, yeah. So when I think about like blockchain stuff, I think the state of the art is that you should try to protect the recipient and you can try to protect the amount. There are projects that are able to make it hard for people to figure out who you are sending money to and also protect the amount that you're sending. And there are different threat models in which you can do this, and there's lots of like different ways to think about what it means to do this. But ultimately, like I try to think in terms of the user experience. If I was going to explain to like my mom how to use it, what I would say is something like, whoever you type, when you send money to your friend here, whoever you fill in the to field there, that's going to be private. Only you and your friend are going to know that this happened. And you want to be able to articulate something like that and for it to be true. So that's kind of how I think about what should be private.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Chris that I think I actually want to double click on this user-centric, user-first approach. I think that should be our guiding principle in the blockchain world, in the sense that I don't really have a specific pecking order as to which fields should be private, which fields should be public. I think it's all up to what developer wants to provide for their users. Let's say, if you want to solve some sort of front-run attack or sandwich attack or MVP problem in DeFi, you probably don't necessarily need to encrypt the receiver-sender address. You probably just want to hide some sort of like trading parameters, because those users, DeFi users, some users don't necessarily care that their address being reviewed public, because that's how things are these days. But they do care that when they make a trade, they don't want other validators or some other people bots scanning the network, be able to front run their trades. And that's just DeFi. And then you also have institutional investors who want to be involved in DeFi a bit more than they are now. So they do care about, especially those whales, those institutional investors, they are concerned about their trades being reviewed to the public. So they care about whether this address should be made public or not. And you also have like in some like NFT, let's say when you do the NFT auction, to make that a little bit private, it's not necessarily about people participate in NFT auction, don't want people to know that they're in the auction. They actually want to be able to participate in some sort of exotic auction mechanism besides just what we currently have. So it's really about being user first and think about whether introducing privacy can improve the end user experience.
So not a blanket, everything must be private. Focus on the why. Certain use cases, certain threat models will have different, more important aspects. Bruno, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, just one thing I feel pretty strongly about is not being too prescriptive about how a user should interact with your software. Open source developers want to come upon your project, really quickly understand what's happening, and then use that to do something with it. Like if Vitalik and the rest of the early Ethereum team would have been really prescriptive about how to build an AMM, like maybe Uniswap wouldn't have gotten built or wouldn't have gotten built like that. And so I think that's one of the challenges with open source software and with privacy specifically is like, how do you build something that's really usable, that's really easy to incorporate without being very prescriptive about how someone should be building. That's how you're going to get like the most unique use cases, the most cool and interesting use cases, the use cases that no one is expecting that will come out of this open source software.
I think also what everyone is saying here is like the technical answer that we always don't want to hear, but it's always true, which is it depends, right? That's about as clear as you can be. And I think like when it comes to data and what sort of information you do want to keep private and you don't, I think there's three broad categories of this, right? When you're thinking about it from your own application development perspective and the prosperity of your own application now and in the future. The first category is that mission critical data, right? This is data that you absolutely need in order for your application to run. And I think people have touched upon this already, right? One other example is like the AMM, right? Like you can't possibly have an AMM running if you don't know how large the size of the pool is and how the ratio of the trades are going, right? So that's mission critical data. And so if you're building an AMM, you probably can't really obfuscate that information. And then the second one is data that enhances your product, right? And this is more so on like the marketing analytics side, right? Which we see where it's, okay, where are all the top users coming from? Where are they clicking? What are they interested in? What's the feedback, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third category of data I would say is just pseudo valuable data, right? This is data that you think is valuable, but then you end up never looking at it, right? So when you have like Google Analytics, for example, right? And you're looking at like the countries that use my application and there's 100 rows, you probably never go past the first 10, right? So like, why do you still keep the other 90? And so I think these are some of the frameworks that can help you think about and reapplying it to the own data and the own on-chain activity that you're tracking, right? Like how can you apply obfuscation to certain aspects that aren't as valuable? And then also, I think we'll touch upon this in a little bit, but like viewing keys, right? Thinking about how can you recreate the data collection process in a way that's very fair to the individual? And I think that's really an ethos of Web3, right? Like how do you empower the individual? Because we all say data is digital gold, right? Bitcoin's digital gold, data's digital gold. I don't know, everything's digital gold these days. But the point being that like, it is extremely valuable. And in traditional internet spaces, right, tech companies, right, all that value, all that power is captured through the centralized entity, which then uses that to create more value for the entity, which then goes back to the shareholders, not necessarily the individuals. And I think like for Web3, that gives us an opportunity whereby we could potentially still find a way to extract valuable data that can help improve the value of the product, but extract it in a way that also maintains some type of fairness to the individual. And I think maybe viewing keys could be an opportunity for that. But anyway, that's maybe a further conversation.
That's great. I think Chris also in our panel prep did mention something I thought was quite interesting. Do you want to maybe double click into stealth addresses?
I think one thing that I think is really important in terms of establishing concepts for blockchain is, and for privacy in blockchain, is to try to think about the difference between pseudonymous technologies and anonymous technologies and how these things are different. Like the idea that you can have a pseudonym in Bitcoin, which is your public address, but all of your activity will be tied to that address. And then the more and more activity you have, the more and more likely it is that someone else will be able to figure out who you are and then figure out that you did all this other activity. Stealth addresses are a technology that a number of privacy enhanced technology chains have used to try to prevent this kind of linkage so that each interaction or each time you receive a payment, it's going to a different address. And not every like privacy blockchain uses the term stealth addresses. Like I don't think Zcash specifically uses the term stealth addresses, but they have something equivalent in their chain where there's a key that's pseudo-random across all of your different transactions that lands in your TX out field. And yeah, I think one of the, like for somebody who's new to the field and is getting initiated into what privacy enhanced blockchains are like, I would say understanding the difference between these pseudonymous and these anonymous technologies and how they can protect your activities is just like really important. Because I think most privacy have agreed that Bitcoin is not private enough to be widely adopted for payments. It's not a good thing if whenever I go to the grocery store to buy groceries, the grocery store can see how much my rent is because they can see my address. That's going to cause all kinds of weird societal effects if people can learn this much about each other this way. And so having some kind of way to use this system in an actually anonymous way where not all your activity is linked together is just really important.
And also on the note of stealth addresses, I like to do this exercise a lot when we're doing these types of talks. How many of you guys use MetaMask? Raise your hand. All right, so keep your hands up. Now put your hand down if you only have one MetaMask address. All right, so here, this highlights a point, right? I think 99% of you all kept your hands up. The point is that a public address, you're already trying to extract the value of a stealth address by proxying it, by creating multiple different wallet addresses. I'm assuming, right, that you're creating all these multiple different wallet addresses because you don't want everything linked. And so regardless of if you think about like privacy or not, I think like in the back of our minds, it's already there. And so the stealth addresses is just like a much better user experience because then you can truly have one address that can completely shield all of your transactions from varying parties so the grocer doesn't see your rent.
Yeah, I think what you described is trying to build multiple identities, and it becomes really complicated to manage. Better is if at the base level you're protecting us. Are you guys ready to battle it out? My next question is, in the UPA slide, there were a lot of logos. There are a lot of you. If I were a dev, how do I start thinking about which ones are better for me to try and work with? How do I make the trade-offs, et cetera? We can go in any order.
I guess I'll go first. Yeah, one thing that we're thinking about at Aztec is there is this total addressable market of developers that can actually use a lot of the privacy tools that we and other projects here are building, specifically like the zero-knowledge domain-specific languages. Many of those just require a certain type of person, a certain type of experience, a certain type of thinking. We like to say that many of these require a cryptography brain as well as a regular just software developer brain. We want to make that a lot easier. We want to remove the need to have to be a cryptographer to incorporate zero knowledge into your programs. We want Noir, our ZK DSL, is highly abstracted. And the point there is that you're just a developer with some experience writing in like a Rust or something similar, and you get a similar syntax that you're comfortable with, you're familiar with. We abstract away almost all of the cryptography to make it really easy for you to incorporate this into your application. If you believe zero-knowledge proofs are going to open up the door for a variety of use cases, both in a blockchain context and outside of a blockchain context, it needs to be easy for the regular software developer to incorporate them into their applications inside or outside of a blockchain context. So that's how we think about it. We want to make it as easy as possible to expand the total addressable market of developers that can actually use these tools to build cool stuff with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Orchid has an actual VPN application, so it's in the application space, which is a little bit different from developers that want to use some of our tech, and we're working on that more so we have more useful things for developers. But so we're trying to encourage more people to be a little bit more privacy conscious, use our VPN product that's built on decentralized tech.
Sorry, so you're saying a user of Orchid would be able to do what?
A user of Orchid can mask their IP address.
Not so much, you're not serving as an intermediary between users and builders.
Yeah, we have all of our stuff is open source. And there's a lot of pieces of our tech stack that we haven't talked about a lot of, that we're going to be talking more about, that can be useful for other decentralized projects, how we're handling our payment system, and some other things that we've been working on. But for now, we have a VPN application that not only can help mask your IP address to give you a little bit more privacy from your internet service provider, but also in the case of a hostile government that is totally blocking access to a lot of different websites, we're helping people get access to the open internet so that they can actually use Twitter and send reports out from places like Iran.
Thank you. We don't have to go in order.
Okay, I'll just I don't know. I'm a person of pattern behavior. So with Manta Network, I think like a lot of the sort of technologies, a lot of the value propositions are already described. We don't do anything related to VPNs, so not really in that space. But
We'll fight later then.
Okay, yeah, bringing different weapons to the arena here. But for myself, or for Manta Network, one of the I think audiences of developers that we really want to focus on, and I think this is something that should be an invitation to more of the broader privacy ecosystem, right? Is right now Web3 I think is suffering from a major problem. We're just eating each other's pie. And the market size is very small, and in order to bring in Web2 users, the friction is very high, even for Web3 users. Oh my gosh, you're telling me I have to switch to this layer 2 and then move to this layer 2, and then I have to wait 30 minutes and all this stuff. By the time the ETH has moved over, I've already forgotten. And so the user experience, even in Web3, is pretty complicated. And so the question, like we all talk about better user experience, but like how? And so from our perspective, like I think one of the challenges that we really want to tackle is how do you create more of a Web 2.5 experience? And what I mean by that is essentially like a hybrid user experience whereby thinking from first principles, when do users need a wallet address? When do users need to interact on chain? When do users need this versus that? Versus like how do you bring on more users onboarded into Web3? And I think like those two questions or those two categories of questions can be independent, right? Because if your goal is to onboard Web2 users, right, you need to build an experience that allows Web2 users to be easily onboarded, which may not necessarily match the experience that you're building for purely Web3 users who are like, oh, I don't care, I can switch over to 10 layer 2s and I'll remember all of it. That's not me. But for us, right, thinking about building out APIs, SDKs that can actually be used by developers who aren't really familiar with the Web3 space and having that on-chain privacy aspect connected into their application from day one, such that when users come in, we say, oh, everyone enters from Bitcoin or everyone enters from like a centralized exchange. Why not everyone enter from a privacy tool and they have privacy from day one, and then they say, hey, why doesn't this blockchain have the privacy requirements that I'm looking for? Instead of, oh, maybe I should go out and look for privacy. So if you are a developer who is building a mobile application, you're looking for ways to integrate into Web3, right? Like definitely check out our APIs and SDKs, and happy to talk more about it.
But what exactly could we do now with Manta Network?
Yeah, we've been testing this out with a project called Moonbeam. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them or not. They're also an EVM compatible project. And from day one with Manta, what we were thinking about was like, how do you build privacy as a utility? And I think that resonates with a lot of the themes that I've been talking about today, which is like we have to make it as cheap as possible so it's accessible as possible. We have to make it as much in the background as possible. And so one of the things that we're building with Moonbeam using our APIs is remote transact. So Moonbeam, developers are able to, for example, build smart contracts on Moonbeam and then use Manta Network's privacy enhancing features, for lack of a better term, remotely through Moonbeam EVM. And they can remote transact so that they can add privacy features directly through Moonbeam applications, but all the privacy functionality runs in the back end through Manta Network. And so that's the same sort of experience we hope that.
Is that similar to Aztec Connect-ish?
Not exactly. Frankly, I'm not fully aware of what their partnership is with
You're
Moonbeam.
just trying to spark a fire.
Yeah. Yeah, but
we got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, the way Aztec Connect works, and I actually see several people in the crowd that are actually building applications using Aztec Connect. If anyone wants to come up after, I can introduce you to these projects and they could talk a little bit more about their own development experience. But the way Aztec Connect works is you're basically, as a user, hiding in a crowd of other users. And so to Chris's point about, I suck at pronouncing this, but pseudonymity versus anonymity, like you're just hiding in a crowd. So if all of us were to deposit 1 ETH into Aztec Connect, and I wanted to do a transaction on Lido to stake my ETH, you would see that the Aztec rollup contract has settled 1 transaction on Ethereum on Lido for 1 ETH, but you won't know which of the 5 of us it was that actually did that interaction. And so it didn't sound super similar to what Kenny was describing, but I'm just not that familiar with the project to be able to say.
Yeah, I think that sounds more close to a shielded pool, right? If you think about the UTXO model, you have transactions that are happening in that shielded pool, but you don't really know what transactions are linked to who. Yeah.
Hi. So to go back to the original question of if you're a developer, how do you evaluate different privacy blockchains? How do you decide what to build on and so on? I would say one of the things that I try to do when I look at blockchain projects is try to understand what differentiates this product, what sort of niche are they going after, because there are a lot of projects, but a lot of them are actually like differentiated in subtle ways, and you have to kind of read and sometimes talk to people to try to figure out why one might be better than another for a certain application. Another thing I look for is if somebody is saying that they have a privacy property, they should have a written threat model somewhere, and you should be able to read and understand if you're a developer, if you're a technical person. If somebody's saying that they have privacy properties, but they don't have a clear threat model, that's, in my mind, that's like sort of a yellow flag or something. And there may be a threat model there, and you might have to talk to somebody to figure out what it is. But it's hard to build on top of something if you don't really understand exactly what the guarantees are or what the developers think that it does, like in very precise terms. I think so. So for Mobilecoin, for example, like our niche is that we're going after payments. We want to be the best possible way for people to pay for things using blockchain technology. And a lot of blockchains are not focused on that. Like we do not have smart contracts. We're not super interested in doing that right now because it's not required for building the best possible user experience for private blockchain payments. Yeah, I think like for Mobilecoin, we don't think of ourselves as competing with a lot of these other projects. We're largely competing with like credit cards, I would say.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so at Oasis, our positioning has been pretty clear to the developer community out there. We provide the privacy layer for Web3. And we start with EVM, Solidity, because that is the biggest developer group out there in the blockchain industry. But we're not stopping at Solidity. We have WebAssembly, Rust, also on the roadmap, and then soon to be released on mainnet for everyone to use. But in terms of providing confidentiality to Solidity developers, as well as to all the dApps building on EVM, so Oasis, we're currently using trust execution environment. I think there's going to be a panel, probably 2 panels after this, that is specifically talking about the pros and cons, risks, benefits of using that technology, that privacy preserving technology. I know ZK is very hot today. I know we have 2 panelists very much advocating for ZK. I personally do like ZK technology as well, but I do want to point out that all these privacy technology, whether that is secure hardware or ZK or full homomorphic encryption, those are not mutually strictly exclusive. They can be very complementary to one another. And Oasis, the privacy layer, what we meant by privacy layer is that so the developers, you can be building dApps, or maybe you're already operating a dApp on, let's say, on BNB network, on Ethereum, on Polygon, on any EVM network where you see users, where you see liquidity with basically what dApp developer cares most about. By using Oasis privacy solution, you actually get to stay where you are. You don't necessarily need to migrate to Oasis. We're not asking you to migrate at all. You stay where you are because that's where you get the most users and liquidity. That's how you get momentum with your applications. But by constructing the confidential smart contracts on Oasis network, you get to add confidentiality to the part of your dApp that you believe that privacy could bring benefit to the end user experience. And that's it. It's very simple. And the reason we want to using trust execution environment at the moment is because it is best in terms of suitable for general purpose computing. ZK is great, but as far as I know, at this moment, ZK has a limitation when it comes to can it serve arbitrary computation or the scalability. Sometimes there are even costs involved as well.
Linda, I want to jump in here. I was on your website yesterday on the blog, and there's this idea of a privacy sidechain. Is that one of your core kind of products? Is that how?
Yeah, that's the privacy layer.
Okay.
That's the same product. Yeah.
Kenny, is that similar-ish to what you described, or not so much?
I don't know. I didn't read the blog.
All right, cool. Enough with fires. I think we're at time. Thank you all for speaking today. And they'll be available, I think, throughout the whole of this session. So please approach them if you have any questions. come up, that would be great. If you know who you are, come up. Otherwise, it's Travis, Guy, Josh, and Ahmed.
Where is Guy and Travis? We lost our panelists. Anyone from Secret around? Travis, Guy. Sound like a mother. I'm not a parent. If anyone's a parent here, this is how it feels. Not motivated.
I'm Ahmed. I am the General Counsel of NIM.
I'm Josh Whitehart. I had growth at the Electric Coin Company, and we invented and support Zcash.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is how to beat surveillance capitalism and reclaim your privacy. It is past 5 at my side of the world in Europe, so I think we could actually advocate for a drinking game. Water, of course, we need hydration. Each time I say the word surveillance capitalism, it is going to come up quite a lot.
Cheers.
Don't judge me for it. All right, let's start off. Privacy is usually associated with negative scenarios or only used as necessary. Given the level of surveillance capitalism and the impact on our digital lives, it seems that it should actually be viewed even more negatively. And this does not seem to be the case, right? People object, but nothing happens. We joke about how our mobile phones are listening to us, and social media ads popping up based on our words and even our thoughts. But society hasn't fully revolted, saying this is not okay. So how are enterprises actually getting away with it? Are we actually rationalizing the situation with resigned cynicism, or are we swayed by the propaganda that this is actually technological inevitability? Maybe you can hear from Guy and Josh.
Yeah, sure. You touch on cynicism. I think the fact that people are being a bit cynic about it, we don't control our data, or this whole thing is messed up. We're pregnant, about to have a baby, we're being targeted with the diaper ads and all that. So I think those things are actually positive in the sense that that kind of like bottom-up bubbling up is always like a prelude, in my opinion, to a revolution. Now, look, like the public is decentralized. It's like it's hard to reach a threshold where like the majority of the people just rise up and do something. But I think those voices are like empowering us, like the people like in this panel, in this room,
in everything that we're doing to know that like we're on the right track. And I think it's really up to us to actually give the people, give the users the alternatives where they can come up and then say, then they can actually take action. I think right now the problem is that all of these are like still being shaped up, still being in place. Just if you look at this panel between Zcash working on private payments, private monetary policy, between Orchid working on private communication, Secret working on private computation, like eventually those technologies are going to reach some critical mass, and we will be able to build better alternatives. And with those better alternatives, I think that's where the revolution happens. I don't think this is the kind of revolution that we see people like storming the gates or something. It's just a quieter revolution where there will be better alternatives.
Yeah, because revolutions are bloody and ugly and take a long time, and people have to put a lot at risk. And so I think you're right. But fundamentally, I think it's just a misalignment of incentives, right? So a few of them, one is like time and time preference. So as a user, I want to have immediate gratification. I think I saw in the paper this morning or something, on the web this morning, that's how old I am, where like Amazon is increasing its capability in terms of real-time deliveries to your front doorstep. We want that immediate gratification. We're willing to trade some long-term damage for time. So the companies may not have the same time preference. Social media sites, it's fine. They can accumulate data over a longer period of time in order to be able to use that data. So they swap you. So the incentives are messed up. And it leads to a tragedy of the commons, right? So you as an individual are making a decision to make that trade, and then in aggregate, all of us are making decisions to make that trade. And then the social media companies or the Web 2 companies are able to aggregate all that data and use that back against the individual in order to try to manipulate behavior. And maybe the third is just that it compounds over time, right? So it's a misalignment of power. So as an individual, you have a power to make a certain decision in a certain period of time. But the company that's accumulating all of this data over a long period of time is accumulating power exponentially in their ability to understand you and who you are as even kind of people groups and groupings in order to try to construct behavior. So I don't think it's like propaganda necessarily or evil, it's capitalism. But then it's incumbent on people to create better options that better align the incentives.
So you mentioned misalignment of power, and I think a lot of people outside of this room, especially general public, my mom and dad, your mom and dad, friends and everything, they are a little bit reliant on the government to help them reclaim their power. However, it almost seems like the logic of surveillance capitalism is actually ingrained in many governments. Ahmed, you litigated the first criminal trial to challenge bulk metadata collection by the NSA under Section 215 of the Patriot Act. And Josh, I think you have personal experience in building something that the government ended up being very interested in, which led you to be on this side of privacy today. Are governments actually truly motivated to implement preventive measures against surveillance capitalism, given the overlapping objectives?
I want to find out what you were building, but we'll save that for later. But absolutely not. Governments are not motivated and have no incentive to stand against surveillance capitalism, irrespective of what your congressperson tells you. They will not use those terms. They will not say that they don't want data holders to hold our data. What they might want is separation of, or breaking up some of the big tech companies into smaller companies, but none of, so far my review of literally everything that I've reviewed does not reveal that any government representative actually wants any of these entities to install or instill privacy protections. So the incentive is not there. But what, and as a result, like part of, if we just step back for a second, right, it turns out that, and this kind of goes to what Josh was saying earlier, two of the greatest inventions of our time are the telephone and the internet, right? And they also happen to be two of the best surveillance devices, right? And so we would have to get rid of the internet entirely, right, to block the internet from our threat model of privacy and anti-surveillance. The cool thing about Web3, I think, and the cool thing about more generally just decentralization of blockchain, is that it changes the incentive structure, right? So as we chat and talk to each other, communicate, we leave behind digital traces with third parties. These third parties are big tech for the most part, right? And the problem is that big tech is incentivized by capitalism or surveillance capitalism to store, harvest, process, and buy and sell your data, right? What this ecosystem does is change that incentivization model from one where we basically prey on user data to one where we satisfy, where our incentives are aligned with something else. Now, does that necessarily mean that Web3 is inherently a privacy preserving ecosystem? Absolutely not. In fact, we are an incredibly transparent ecosystem by the very nature of what a blockchain is, right? But all that means is that we have to try harder and to protect privacy, right? And the few groups that are part of the UPA are groups that are doing that. And I'm gonna just stop talking now because Josh is giving me a look.
I'm not looking at you up.
He does his
I'm
thing,
like, there is a lot to unpack there.
It's a side eye.
There's no. By the way, little secret, I'm actually blind in my right eye, so I can't give you side eye.
That's not true. There's no way. There's no way to verify that without revealing his medical history, which would be a violation of his privacy rights. We're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was.
No, that was really good.
Yeah.
But I'm totally more optimistic than you are.
Okay.
And I think there's the whole Web3 thing, there's the government thing. I'll hit on the government thing. You had asked about some stuff that was built. The truth of it is, like a long time ago, 20 years ago, again, disclosing some private information about my age, I managed a program in the Middle East. We built a reconnaissance system for a government in the Middle East, largely using satellite data, but a number of sensors, and they were tracking facilities and assets of potential targets and potential foes in the Gulf. So that tooling that we built aggregated all this data, both data and metadata. So you take a picture, you can tell what's on the ground based on the shape of the airplane, what kind of airplane it is, based on other assets that are around that airplane, what might be going on and all that kind of stuff. And then you're doing some predictive analysis on what that country might be intending to do. So fast forward about 10 years from then, the architect on that project, he and I got together, and he was the brains of the whole thing, but we started aggregating data that we could get off the internet. So we pulled together, at that time it was about 26 different sites. We effectively surveilled about 30 million Americans. We put together very detailed profiles on people. The intent was initially, it's just marketing, right? And initially it was like people that travel. So people that travel, they take their pictures, they put stuff up on the internet. We can tell what they're doing in the pictures, all the metadata associated with it, whether they're wealthy, whether they're not wealthy, what kind of travel they like. And it started getting a little creepy. In fact, my business partner wrote up a utility or an internal tool called the Creepy Crawler that allowed you to type in somebody's name, and it pulled up a full kind of set of information about who they were, where they lived, again, like likely how much money they had, because you can tell things like that based upon your home purchase is a public record. Most people do it in their own name. So we know how much your home is worth. Your car records are public record. You can get that information. Where you work, everybody puts that stuff on LinkedIn. It's publicly available, so we know where you got your education, what companies you're working for. We know generally what people make because they report through things like Glassdoor, what they've made for a particular role at a given organization. We can put together a lot of detail about people. We started with advertising, we moved to predicting how good people were at their jobs with the goal of trying to align freelancers with companies. And how much those companies should pay those freelancers based on how good they are at their jobs. And we got contacted by a government contractor, and the government contractor wanted to know, can I use this system to determine somebody's political bias? Because we find that certain types of people do better at our organization than other types of people. This was all pre-Cambridge Analytica. We shut it down at that point. We didn't want to have access to the data. We didn't want to be asked for the data. We're pretty concerned. So when Cambridge Analytica came out, it was no kind of big surprise, and that was just one data source. But that's what we're working on. But the reason I'm more optimistic is because we have found people, like in the US government, for example, on the Hill, who are advocates for privacy and for the rights of US citizens, who have fought against things like the Patriot Act, who have been vocal opponents of things like BSA in places where there's overreach, I do think that we can get there with a combination of the right incentives and some of the right people in some of those roles. I see that more on the Hill. I don't see that as much on the regulatory side, because on the regulatory side, people are going to use the tools that they have available. And there's no doubt that all the three-letter agencies have relationships with social media companies and that kind of thing, and are also mining that data.
I don't know if any of you were concerned, but I'm glad I wasn't on US soil 20 years ago. You might need to text your mom and dad about that. All right, let me veer away from government before Josh actually gives me a look, in case DC is actually watching this. Let's talk about Google, our favorite topic, right? Back then, it was lauded for its technological prowess and for being extremely innovative. I remember being excited about Google when somebody said to me, Google it. I said, what is that? What was I using then? Yahoo? I can't remember. But we all should be aware that it actually largely pioneered surveillance capitalism. It was so revolutionary, it actually brought forth a whole generation of specialist ad tech companies. I should know, I think it was one of the first unicorns companies in French tech, was actually Criteo, which is an ad tech, huge ad tech company. Today, it is deemed as a big, bad tech company, as we actually realize how bad the situation is. And I think it is the worst that it has ever been. So, Travis, you moved from Web 2 and using all our data and loving it to Web 3. Has surveillance capitalism actually reached saturation point? Or will the advent of Web 3 companies innovate it further, causing even more danger to us as a society?
Yeah, I think we're not there yet. Obviously, Google is a juggernaut, spinning off tons of cash, and it's not even clear what a lot of the employees do there, but they try new stuff, they're trying to innovate, and they have this massive cash cow that they've developed over time. When I was working on the QuickBooks brand, I did a lot of work in ad tech and looking at ad tech technologies. We used a company called Kochava to do all of our mobile ad tracking, and so that's like you always want a third party to arbitrate between the different places you're buying ads to tell you when a user purchases from you, was that a Facebook ad they saw? Was that LinkedIn ad? Was it a Google ad? And it's, of course, tracking immense amounts of information about all these different users and pulling it into a central place, a third-party place where they're storing it on their servers. And I was there when Kochava announced their exchange, which was their ad buying play, and it was shocking. Like, the executives at QuickBooks were scared, they were nervous, they had no idea why they were talking about blockchain. And I think that they are still working on that, but they are first this kind of tracking platform that is then trying to back their way into a Web3 ad network that's somewhat privacy preserving. I think there's other plays out there that have tried to dabble in that space, but I think it's going to be pretty hard to unseat the Web 2 platforms, and I think it's going to take more time. So I'm still hopeful that we can get away from the pieces of surveillance capitalism and the collection of data and then the AI modeling that goes on top of that to do prediction over what your next action is going to be and then trying to modify that pathway. Google is really good at that. I heard that they have a pre-search team, which sounds very sci-fi and scary. When you sit down at that prompt, they have a reasonable chance of guessing what you're going to search before you even search it. And if you think about that, it's pretty scary.
Guy, given what you did in your time at MIT and then Enigma and then now being founder of Secret Network, I think you have a lot to say about this.
Yeah, so I'll actually start with a bit more optimistic view. I mean, it does go back to incentives, I think, and until I think a few years ago, there were not really big incentives for big corporations like Google and others to change the ways. I think that is slightly shifting, not enough, it's like baby steps. But whether it's regulation, whether it's Web3, whether it's like all these privacy-enhancing technologies that were sci-fi until a decade ago, but are actually becoming realistic and practical in these days, even companies like Google are putting a lot of research and then turning that into production effort into privacy-preserving technologies. And I do think this whole privacy-preserving, confidential computing, whatever you want to call it, movement goes bigger than just Web3. It goes back to Web 2. But I think Web3 just has the let's say, we have the best chance and most likelihood to basically steer those big companies in the right direction, because without that, they're not incentivized to do it. But I do want to show a little bit more optimism on that front. With that said, I don't think we can wait around. I think, look, big corporations at the end of the day, they need to take care of their shareholders. That's like their primary concern. And even if these were like at some point 20, 30 years ago, like great startups, where people had a lot of, let's say, good intentions in mind, like the famous Google do no evil, which kind of went away, then it's reasonable from their incentive maximization, profit maximization, to do what's best for their shareholders. And sometimes, in many cases, that does not align with privacy. And I think what we as Web3 should do to Google is like what OpenAI is doing to Google right now with GPT. So Google, Facebook, all of that, they always kept their models. Like they started to give the algorithms, like public, like TensorFlow, all that, but they never gave the model. They never gave the actual source. They definitely never gave the data, and it's a good thing that they didn't give the data. But now that, like you've seen with AI, like with Facebook releasing the model in open source, and it's almost like a race to the bottom to make these more public goods and common goods, that's what we as Web3 should do. We should force their hands by giving better alternatives or better technologies so that they would be forced to correct their ways or see the light in some form. That's my belief.
So you mentioned incentives. So obviously surveillance capitalism, so it's driven by profit-making incentives. So the crypto industry has seen the emergence of token economics. So I'm going to be very careful when saying token because my general counsel here gets on high alert every time. We
don't mention the token.
Yeah, we don't mention the token. We don't mention the token price. We don't say the word moon. Got to be careful. All right.
Apparently we can't use emojis too, right?
Yeah, no, apparently not. Can tokenization offer alternative ownership and business models to surveillance capitalism? All right, General Counsel, go ahead.
Okay, so I think in theory, yes, absolutely. And that's the kind of cool thing about Web3 is that there is theoretically a different incentive structure while maintaining being a capitalist, right? Because we're not going to change that. Unless you guys want to change that, meet me outside later. We could talk about which protest we're going to. But if we're not changing capitalism, we need to find some other incentive structure, right? And that's what tokenization might do. I don't know. I have other comments. So I'll just wait to make the other comments. But the short answer is yes. I think absolutely yes.
Do you need to put up a disclaimer before?
Oh, no real disclaimer. I think in theory, yes, tokens do create a different incentive structure. Absolutely.
Travis?
Yeah, getting back to Google and maybe some positive things to think about. I think ChatGPT has shaken Google to its core. I don't know if you guys use Google. I do. I wanted to learn about foundations a little while ago. I'm searching about foundations. I have to go through 10 different websites. I got ads popping up. I got all this JavaScript running. I start talking to ChatGPT about foundations, and suddenly I know everything. And it's just going back and forth. It's telling me all this information that I want to look up. And what's great is it's not like I can load a website and pay it 10 millipennies. Hey, Mr. Website, I love what you're doing. I want to pay for your server costs. I want to give you some profit. Here's 10 millipennies. Can't do it. They have to have this totally backwards ad mechanism. It's like the internet was built and then it got moved in this weird direction because the business models didn't work. And you could only send people 25 cents, and then the credit card company would charge you 25 cents. You can't send small payments. So you have to do this whole ad model. And I think that looking at the positive side, not even from the Web3 space, these incumbents can be disrupted, and there's going to be a lot of opportunity for us to come in with new business models and new ways of transaction. And I think that really small payments could be our way out.
Just shifting direction of this discussion a little bit, maybe touching back onto government and regulation. When we talk about surveillance capitalism, we must, of course, reference Shoshana Zuboff. She poses the question, will we be the masters of information or will we be its slaves? I think we're here today as privacy-preserving companies and developers who are interested in privacy because we understand that and we believe that the former is actually possible. and within our control, starting by building with privacy by default and by design. However, implementing measures against misuse of enterprise surveillance is very difficult for countries because it requires a structural change to the system. What is the fastest route for us to reclaim our privacy? Is it regulation, or can we build our way out of it, especially with the unprecedented innovation we've seen in the Web3 space? Josh?
You're asking if we can trust the government to build this solution for us. We probably have a common perspective on that in this room, would be my guess. So we've got to build it. The reality is that here's the scary thing about Web3, right? It actually has the potential to be worse than Web 2 as it relates to privacy. Because at least with Web 2, if I go to Amazon and I buy something, it's between me and Amazon. But it's not the whole world. Now, we put something on Web3, and it's for everybody to see for all time on a mutable database that can never be removed. So it's not even compatible with GDPR in the EU. So the regulations that are there, anytime a regulator is going to get involved, is going to be like inherently brittle right out of the gate. There'll be a tendency towards overreach. It's really incumbent upon the builders here, the builders in this room, why I'm excited about things like UPA, to build the fundamentals into the core so that we do have privacy protections by default, and giving the user the consent, the power to be able to consent to disclosure of that information. But it's got to start here. It's got to start with you guys in this room.
Guy, would you like to add on any comments?
No point. Same perspective, like we should talk to regulators, we should try to educate them, but at the same time, we can't wait for regulators. Like we have to build the future and I guess hope they see the light.
That's very benign. Okay, I guess my question was, what's the fastest route? So we're just saying it's a bit of a middle ground and we need to find some sort of constructive solutions to create and continue creating thriving businesses and to also demonstrate that there are better solutions than blatant surveillance capitalism. But that's going to take a lot of time, doesn't it?
Just to chime in, I think it's not just the fastest route, I think it's the only route. I don't think that depending on the government, and again, when I was talking about incentives, I'm only talking about the government. My whole life I've spent either as a human rights lawyer or a criminal defense lawyer or somebody involved with the principle of due process, and then finally an academic, and I have never felt like I'm impacting the world as much as I do at a private company that happens to be in the Web3 space, believe it or not. And the reason that I've transitioned into this role is because I actually believe that we can effectuate change through technology. I don't for half a second believe that we can effectuate real change through regulation or through politics. And I'm not saying that because I'm a hater, I'm just saying that because I've been alive for, I don't know, X amount of years, less than this guy amount of years, but sufficient amount of years just to, I think, be very legitimately, I wouldn't even, it's just everything I know is that the government does not move at all. Let's say they move very slowly, just to be fair. So yeah, it's definitely going to be the fastest way to change and potentially the only way, I think, given the reality.
All right, so last question for the panels, we're running out of time. So to quote Shoshana again, she said, let's close doors, but let's make sure they are the right ones. So this is a question for everyone on the panel. What should we stop doing and what should we start doing? That was a surprise question. They were not prepped for this.
I'm sure I can take that as developers and builders, delete more stuff, don't store stuff. That's a simple one. And I think that the regulation one is tough. I'll defer that to lawyers here. And I think when we think of surveillance capitalism, remember it's a business model, and business models can be disrupted. They can be destroyed pretty quickly.
I think it takes much more effort to close doors than to open them. And I'm a builder too, so I guess I don't have a good answer about what we should close. I think we should just continue to build. And I think things will change within a few years, like as long as we stay the course.
Ahmed?
Yeah, more privacy by default, less surveillance capitalism, and that is a legally compliant answer.
Like, we should stop being so defeatist. Like, I said it on some other kind of panel where we were talking about, like, why does nobody care about privacy, and it's total bunk. people do, and the economics are changing, like Apple's campaigns, and really, because they have a different economic model, right? They have a different incentive structure. They want you to buy little power adapters for every phone. So they can make money off of that. They don't have to make money off your data. So build different incentive structures. If you really care about this, I think that's what it's going to take to do. Those are the doors. The other thing is just keep the doors open. So it's important that we have conversations with regulators and policymakers so that they don't make rash, bad decisions. Shut the doors that are impossible then to open, so we don't have situations like BSA or things like that where it's like impossible to get that thing switched. Because once a regulation is in place, it's really difficult to change course. So we need to keep those doors open, keep minds open while we're building faster than the regulators can move.
I'm a bit kinder than Michelle. I'm not going to start any fight here. However, I'm not a panelist, but I do want to say that I see privacy as a movement that we all should do collectively. It's a bit like the climate chaos, right? Like back in those days, we thought everything was great. And then now it's coming together and just pushing a narrative, and things actually are starting to happen, but it's a bit too late. So I hope that with privacy, it's not going to take the same route, that we're going to start actually understanding developers here, start building. Let's not leave a legacy of damage and remorse and just like whinging about what we should have done earlier, like what we see in the climate chaos today. Yeah? Great. All right. I hope you have a bit of understanding of what surveillance capitalism is today in our digital lives, and it's not going to go away. So keep building and speak to anybody in UPA here, and they can get you started on actually making a difference. Thank you, everyone.
Bob,